This lecture continues to look at the welfare implications of protectionist policies, specifically NTBs, focusing on quotas and export subsidies within markets that are still assumed to be perfectly competitive. Let's start out with import quotas. These are explicit limits on the quantities of a product that can be imported into a country, usually over a specified time period. To analyze the effect on a country that imposes an import quota on a product, we continue to make the distinction between a small country and a large country. For a small country whose demand levels do not impact on the world price, and which has a comparative disadvantage in producing the good, assuming that free trade is again the status quo, the following results from the imposition of an import quota. The domestic price of the good is increased, which increases the producer surplus and decreases the consumer surplus. There is a deadweight loss that results from this. The overall welfare is reduced with the quota compared to the free trade status quo. Depicting this on the graphs below as before, we have the global market on the right side and the home market for the goods on the left. In the global market, the small country's demand is IDH and downward sloping. The world price is PW, at which point is the horizontal export supply function to indicate that the small country exerts no influence on the world price by changing its demand levels. The small country therefore imports M1, given that price. The corresponding impact of the price of PW is seen in the home market. The total demand comprises the supply from home producers and imports from abroad. Total surplus is maximized at PW. Now, with the imposition of a quota, say at M2, by the government in the small country, as shown, this has the effect of increasing the price that the good can be sold at the home country, given the import demand curve. This price is PQ. This increases the producer surplus and reduces the consumer surplus and creates a deadweight loss. Let us now illustrate this with a numerical example. We assume a small country facing a world price PW of $20 per unit and importing 15 million units of the good from abroad. Under autarky, the price of the good would have been higher at $35. We now investigate the welfare impact of the government imposing a quota of 5 million units of the good on imports. We have this illustrated in the two diagrams depicted on this slide. Under free trade, with imports of 15 million units, total home demand is 20 million units, and the remaining 5 million units is supplied by the home producers. With the imposition of an import quota of 5 million units, the home price of the good rises to $30 per unit, and home suppliers can now supply more, that is, 10 million units. So what are the welfare impacts of this? Under free trade, the consumer surplus is $400 million, and the producer surplus is $25 million. The total surplus in this case is $425 million. When looking at the post-quota welfare picture, we see that the consumer surplus has now fallen to $225 million, and the producer surplus is now much larger at $100 million. The total surplus is $325 million, and society is worse off from having the quota in place. Note that the difference in the total surplus is a measure of the deadweight loss, and this is $100 million. The quota provides protection to the small country's producers, but costs the economy $100 million in the process that is simply wasted. In practice, a quota can be implemented in a number of ways, which may change the analysis we just computed and the welfare implications somewhat significantly. The government, in implementing a quota, could generate quota licenses that license the holder to import a given quantity of the good, such that the total amount of imports provided by the licenses equals the planned quota. These could then be auctioned off or given away freely to domestic firms, or implicitly given to foreign firms through what is called a voluntary export restraint, a VER. So let's look at each of these and the welfare implications that follow. When the quota licenses are auctioned off, if the auction is well organized and competitive, the revenues generated are equal to the tariff equivalent of the quota. In our illustration, the quota caused the home price to rise from $20 to $30 for the quota of 5 million units. With a well-designed competitive auction, this means revenues from the sale of the licenses would generate $50 million in revenue to the government. The deadweight loss as a result is no longer $100 million, but now reduced to $50 million. This is still inefficient, and compared to the free trade scenario, the country is still worse off. An alternative where the government gives away the licenses freely to domestic producers is usually politically attractive, as it not only provides for protection, but also gives these firms quota rents, that is, the revenues the government could have generated through auctioning the permits is given to the firms. This adds to the producer surplus and reduces the deadweight loss again to $50 million. This is, however, the best case scenario. In practice, such rents are very valuable, and firms often lobby to obtain them. Such spending to obtain these rents is called in the economics literature rent-seeking behavior. If this rent-seeking is competitive, then the entire spending by firms to obtain it equals the total amount of the rents available, so that the rents are entirely dissipated and the deadweight loss remains at $100 million. With VERs, the licenses are implicitly given to foreign firms. The idea here being that by encouraging them to voluntarily limit their exports, they are able to take advantage of the resulting higher price that the quota results in by selling directly to consumers in the home country. This was in effect the way we carried out the analysis in the first place. So the deadweight loss from this is 100 million as in our illustration. The interesting thing here is that since the rents are kept with the foreign firms, there is no incentive for retaliation. Hence, it's a voluntary restraint on exports by the foreign country, as they get paid to do so. How does the analysis change when considering a large country? That is, a country whose demand levels for that product influence the global price of the good. Again, with the remaining other assumptions in place, the quota raises the domestic price of the good. This increases producer surplus and decreases the consumer surplus. There is again a deadweight loss, and as with the tariff with a large country, there is also a terms of trade gain because of the large country effect of causing the world price to fall from a reduction in its demand. The welfare effect is thus again ambiguous. We show this in the diagrams on this slide. Again, with a large country, while the demand is still downward sloping IDH, the export supply curve is now an upward sloping function, reflecting the fact that changing the levels of demand will change the global price. At the equilibrium level where the price is PW, imports are M1 under free trade. Now with the imposition of a quota at M2, again the price of the good rises, but only to PQ, because the world price also falls to PW prime, as shown on the left diagram. We explain the welfare effects again with an illustration. Let us suppose now that a large country under autarky had a price for a good at $18 per unit, but under free trade the world price is $8 per unit. This leads to imports of 7 million units. Domestic producers lobby the government for protection, and the government imposes an import quota of 4.2 million units. What will be the welfare impact of this policy? First, we depict this in diagrams as before. The impact of the quota raises the home price of the good to $12 from $8. However, the world price falls as a result of the decrease in demand to $4. Consumers' total demand falls from 8 million to 6 million as they are constrained by the quota of 4.2 million and the resulting higher prices. Domestic supply, however, rises from 1 million to 1.8 million units. Thus, under free trade, the consumer surplus is $64 million, the producer surplus is $2.5 million, and this gives a total surplus of $66.5 million. However, with the quota in place, the consumer surplus is now $36 million, the producer surplus is $8.1 million, and the total surplus has fallen to $44.1 million. If, however, the licenses were auctioned off, the government would have obtained $33.6 million in revenues, of which half of that would have been the terms of trade gain, and this comprises the $4 drop in price multiplied by the import quota of 4.2 million, which gives $16.8 million. The deadweight loss would now have been only $5.6 million. But being less than the terms of trade gain, it makes the country better off from the quota. If the quotas were grandfathered, the outcome would have been similar in terms of the welfare effects to the auction case, except that the government revenues would now be added to producer surplus. If, however, there is competitive rent seeking taking place, then the final outcome would be a deadweight loss of $5.6 million, as this dissipates the entire quota rents, which includes the terms of trade gain. The country is therefore worse off if there is rent-seeking behavior taking place. Finally, with a VER, the deadweight loss is $22.4 million, as in our illustration. It's instructive to note that while again, with a large country case, we saw two quota implementation policies where the quota was welfare improving on the country. These two situations might not be what pans out in reality. First, if quotas are to be grandfathered, there is likely going to be rent-seeking behavior, which, even if it does not result in dissipation of the rent, may still lower the rent to where it's less than the deadweight loss. And second, a trade war will likely ensue with a quota that extracts the terms of trade gain from a trade partner. Let us now turn to export subsidies. An export subsidy is a payment to firms for every unit of a good they produce and export. They are used extensively in most developed nations to protect their agricultural industries, which in a global setting would have a comparative disadvantage. Export subsidies thus allow them to have a government-aided comparative advantage so that they end up exporting instead of importing these products. So how does such a policy affect the welfare of a small country that has them in place? Again, with the assumptions that we have used previously still in place, the impact of an export subsidy is to raise the domestic price of the good beyond the autarky price so that they can now export the product through oversupply. This increases the producer surplus and reduces the consumer surplus. There is a resulting deadweight loss and the economy is worse off compared to under free trade. Again, we depict this in the two diagrams on this slide. In the global market, now the import demand is seen as a horizontal line because it reflects the world demand for the small country's exports. The export supply function for home XSH is upward sloping, showing that varying its export levels does not change the world price. Under free trade, as drawn, the export supply curve does not intersect the import demand curve at all. In fact, if we extend it to intersect the world price, it would do so at a negative export value, indicating that under free trade, this country should be importing, not exporting the product. With the export subsidy in place, the export supply curve shifts out to the right to XSH prime, and the country now exports X1 units. As shown, this allows the price of the product in the small country to rise up to PS. Exports are still sold at PW, the world price, but the government provides a payment equivalent to PS minus PW on each of the X1 units exported. A quick numerical illustration is again provided to analyze the welfare impacts. Assume that under autarky the price of the good would be $3.50 per unit. With free trade, the world price is $3, and at this price imports are 5 million units. With an export subsidy of $2 per export in place, what will be the welfare impact on this small country? As depicted, the subsidy allows domestic firms to raise their home price to $5 per unit. They sell only 5 million at home as they have a resulting surplus of 15 million. These are then exported at the price of $3, the world price, while the government provides a $2 subsidy on each of the 15 million exports. So under free trade, the consumer surplus would have been $22.5 million, the producer surplus $10 million, and a total surplus of $32.5 million. However, with the export subsidy, the consumer surplus is now only $2.5 million, producer surplus is $40 million, the cost of the subsidy is $30 million, and this has to be deducted from the total surplus since it must come from this economy. So the final surplus with the export subsidy is $12.5 million. The economy is worse off by $20 million, which is the deadweight loss that results from the implementation of the export subsidy. Now we investigate the situation for a large country. Again, the assumptions remain as before, except that now the country's supply levels can influence the world price. Hence, it's a large country in this sense. The export subsidy has the following effects. It raises the domestic price of the good beyond the autarky price. Producer surplus increases and consumer surplus decreases. There's a deadweight loss that results from the policy, and welfare is reduced compared to the situation under free trade. Again, we depict this on this slide. Here now we have a downward sloping import demand curve, showing that when the large country changes its export levels, this affects the world price. The export supply function for the large country is XSH and is upward sloping. Again, under free trade, there is no intersection of the export supply and import demand curves that gives positive export levels, since under free trade, this country is importing the product at the price of PW. With the implementation of an export subsidy, the home price of the product rises to PS. As seen, there is a term of trade loss that also results as the world price falls, because the added supply from the home of exports causes the world price to fall. The large country thus exports X1 units at the lower price of PW prime, and the government makes up the difference between PS and PW prime on each of the X1 exports. We look at a numerical illustration of this as follows. Suppose a large country under autarky priced its product competitively at $3.50, but with trade faced a world price of $3 per unit. Let's suppose an export subsidy of $2 per unit is put in place by the government in this large country. What's the welfare impact of this policy on the large country? As depicted here, the implementation of the export subsidy causes the price to rise to $4 per unit, because the surplus that results from the export subsidy, which are exported, creates a global surplus and a reduction in the world price, so that the world price falls to $2, and the subsidy of $2 per unit means that the home consumers face a price of $4 only per unit. So the large home country produces 15 million units, of which it exports 5 million units at the lower price of $2 per unit, and the government provides a $2 subsidy on all 5 million exports. So in terms of welfare effects, under free trade, the consumer surplus was $22.5 million, the producer surplus $10 million, and the total surplus was therefore $32.5 million. However, with the export subsidy in place, the consumer surplus is now $10 million. The producer surplus is $22.5 million. The cost of the subsidy is $10 million. So netting this cost out of the total surplus gives a final post-export subsidy surplus of $22.5 million. The country is therefore worse off with the export subsidy in place. As computed, the deadweight loss is $10 million. And this results from the cost of the subsidy being much larger due to the terms of trade loss from being a large country supplier in the world market, and the large country is therefore worse off with the export subsidy. Now, our analysis has presumed that it's possible to charge a high price at home, even while the world price remains much lower. So what stops consumers from buying the good instead at the lower world price and refusing to buy from home at the higher price that the export subsidy makes possible? Well, usually governments would combine an import tariff with an export subsidy, so that the import price rises significantly high in order to prevent that. This of course makes the policy on the whole prohibitively expensive. On the other hand, if no tariffs are put in place, then the policy still becomes prohibitively expensive, since demand drops towards zero at home and all of production essentially become exports. In other words, the government effectively subsidizes consumer spending on the product, as well as providing export subsidies to producers, thus inefficiently raising the cost of the subsidy even much more. We are now ready to conclude. From a national perspective, NTBs in general are welfare reducing, as are tariffs. Even when export subsidies are often justified as a means of providing aid to poor countries, the logic of comparative advantage does not suggest that poor countries cannot produce enough food. To further aid such countries, developed countries should rather provide cash transfers and open up their own markets to imports of these products. These would generate incentives in the poor countries to produce more and through trade increase their incomes and thus escape poverty. Our next steps include taking the quiz associated with this lecture, getting ready to listen to the next lecture, where we relax the assumption of perfect competition and investigate if our central results do change. So let's get started.